Do you know where one of the greatest knights in the history of Westeros came from? Not from a castle, not from a noble house, not from a crown either. He came from the mud, from hunger, from the roads, from tournament dust. His name was Ser Duncan the Tall. History did not write him down as a king, but remembered him as one of the men who protected kings, who shaped kings. And tonight, we return to the story of that giant man. Everyone knows the glorious face of the king's city, high walls, red stone, palace gossip, the banners of lords. But King's Landing has another face as well. Smoky, narrow, muddy, hungry, flea bottom. Most of the children who grow up in the shadow of the throne can never come near the throne at all. Their names disappear without ever being recorded. They live without being asked who they are and die without being asked. Duncan was one of those children. The sources do not give a clear date for his birth. They do not tell his mother's name, nor who his father was. In fact, for the early years of his childhood, we have only fragments, streets, poverty, the struggle to hold on, a large body drawing attention even at a young age. History is silent here, but silence sometimes tells a great deal. Because in Westeros, for a child who is not noble to go unrecorded is not the exception, but the rule. What made his story visible was not the blood of a dynasty, but the eye of a knight, Ser Harlan of Pennytree, an old, wandering knight without great renown, not a tournament star sung of in songs, not a lord with a castle either. But he had enough patience to take a boy with him, enough discipline to teach him work, and enough faith to take the idea of knighthood, with its flaws, seriously. Duncan entered Ser Arlan's service as a serving boy, then a servant, and at last as a squire. And this was the first real turning point in his life, because what he learned beside Arlan was not only how to clean armor, he learned to know a horse's sweat, the smell of the earth before rain, from the sound of a rusty joint which strap had loosened in an inn room, who would start a drunken fight, and who would quietly draw a knife to keep silent on long roads, to stand watch even when hungry, and most importantly, the words spoken about what a knight ought to be, even if not everyone kept them. This is a very important distinction, because when telling Duncan's early life, some see only misery, torn cloaks, thin horses, muddy roads, cheap inns. All of that is true, but it is incomplete. At Arlan's side, Dunk learned not only how to survive, but also how to hold on to an ideal. He also saw that ideal constantly being violated in the world. Perhaps that is exactly why, later, he would cling to that ideal so stubbornly. Duncan's body also became part of his fate from an early age. He grew very much, taller than ordinary men, broader shouldered, heavier. The moment he entered a room, it was understood at once. This was an advantage in war, but in life, it was not always ease. A big body means a big target. More attention, more mockery, more expectation. People expect either brute force from such men or stupidity. That shadow, too, fell over Duncan very early. But one of the things that makes his story special begins right here, because in the noble lineage-obsessed world of Westeros, a boy with no lineage without receiving courtly upbringing, without maester training, built his own inner compass through nothing but the road, labor, and observation. He made mistakes, he gave in to anger, he felt shame, he doubted, but he tried to preserve a line within himself, the line of standing against those who crush the weak. Even years later, when he stood beside a king in a white cloak, the first trace of that line had been laid in Flea Bottom. At the very bottom of the throne, the road was Duncan's first teacher. His second teacher was the road again. The years spent with Ser Arlan resemble not so much a boy's rise into young manhood as the slow forging of iron. A little more each day, a different trial each season. One day, a dusty road, the next day cold rain. In one place, rumors of a tournament. Elsewhere, a hungry village. In one inn, you sit around the same fire with the Lord's men. The next night, you sleep in a barn. The life of a hedge knight is not as bright as in the songs. Duncan learned this early, but those years gave him not only hardness, but order as well. The rhythm of putting on armor, sword maintenance, the balance of a lance, horsemanship, recognizing house sigils, who is sworn to whom, which lord is at feud with whom, which road is open to bandits. This was knowledge learned on the road, not from books. And in Westeros, sometimes, to survive a battle, it is exactly this kind of knowledge you need before a sword. Still, the most critical issue in Duncan's growth lay beyond technique, identity. He was a squire, but when would he become a knight? Would Arlan knight him? When? Under what condition? The answer to this question is important enough to cast a shadow over Duncan's entire life, because one of the greatest mists left by the sources rises here. It is not certain whether Arlan formally declared Dunk a knight before his death. Duncan said so, but no one saw that moment. No one recorded the ceremony. It had no witness. History is silent here again, and this silence settles at the center of Duncan's life, because after that moment, Dunk lives not only with enemies, but also with the question inside himself: am I truly a knight? Not on paper, not by title, not by ceremony. In essence, before the road to Ashford, this question had not yet fully taken its final shape, but the hand of fate was drawing near. Ser Arlan had grown old. The road had worn him down. The cold of long years, the rain, insufficient food, and exhaustion gather in the body. Those who live in great castles notice this late. Those who live on the road feel it in every step. Arlan fell ill at an inn and died before he could reach the tourney to be held at Ashford Meadow. Duncan buried him with his own hands. This scene is Duncan's true birth, because at the head of that grave, the line was drawn between the child of Flea Bottom and Ser Duncan the Tall. He had no chests of gold as an inheritance in his hand, no great sword either. There was only an old knight's armor, his horses, a few belongings, the habits taught by years, and a terrible loneliness collapsing over his head. Duncan then made a decision. From the outside, this decision looks simple. A squire takes the armor of his dead master and goes to a tourney. But in truth, this is a challenge to the rigid order of Westeros. A young man with no lineage will introduce himself as Sir. He will enter enter among the tents of knights. He will ask for a place in a tourney where lords and princes are present, and he will do this with very little money in his purse and without a powerful house behind him. Many men would have turned back at the very first gate. Dunk did not turn back. When he arrived at Ashford Meadow, what greeted him was splendor, colorful tents, the sound of banner cloth striking in the wind, hoofbeats, the smell of roasting meat, the shouts of market sellers, the gleaming line of slender swords in the sun. But beneath that brightness, there was something else as well. Hierarchy. A world where it was clear who would stand where, who would speak, who would stay silent, and who would be crushed. Duncan stepped directly into that world. The Ashford tourney was not merely a field of competition for Duncan. It was like a small model of Westeros. On the same meadow, there was the pride of the highborn and the fragile livelihood of wandering performers. There were knightly vows and the cruelty of knights. There was the light of finely worked armor and blood spilled behind the tents. Duncan, in his very first days, saw how close these two worlds stood to one another. And then Tansel appeared before him, a tall, graceful artist who told stories with her puppets. Amid the tourney crowd, someone carrying the breath of song and tale. In the hard world of Westeros, such people are usually considered unimportant until the whim of a lord or a prince strikes them. Tansel's place in Duncan's life is defined exactly here, at the center of the moment when cruelty done to someone powerless set the line inside him into motion. Because sometimes the enemy appears not on a battlefield, but in the middle of a crowd. Prince Aerion Targaryen, a man who moved with the arrogance given by lineage and the impunity given by power, a pride poisoned by fire, by dragons, by the supposed superiority of Targaryen blood. His cruelty toward Tansel was not merely a momentary act of brutality. It was the embodiment of the real question standing before Duncan. Is knighthood a toy of the powerful, or is it an oath to protect the powerless? Duncan did not wait long to think. He got involved, he intervened, and that intervention brought the life of a hedge knight into direct collision with princes, lords, and the shadow of the throne. What mattered as much as the punch Duncan threw or the hand he raised was who he aimed it at. In Westeros, when an ordinary man lays a hand on the wrong person, it stops being a fight. It becomes a matter of order. That is exactly what happened at Ashford. It is here that Duncan's greatest friend enters the stage, and at first, without even seeming like a friend. A boy with an egg-like shaved head, curious eyes, a sharp tongue, and a striking self-confidence despite his young age. Egg. At first glance, this child looked like an ordinary squire or apprentice, but he would become one of the names who would set out on the road beside Duncan and change his life. Their relationship is far more complicated than the classic master-servant order. Sometimes squire and knight, sometimes child and protector, and sometimes two stubborn traveling companions. Duncan's rivals at Ashford, however, were not limited to Aerion alone. The tourney ground sets a trial at every step. Some men looked down on him. Some saw his height and despised him because he had no lineage. Some sensed, or wanted to sense, but he was not a real Ser. Others mistook his honesty for stupidity. Duncan knew the language of this world, but this language had no heart, and he often acted with his heart. This made him both a loved man and an easy target. Still, the most important truth of Ashford was this: Duncan did not gain only enemies there, he gained witnesses. Some nobles saw the nobility within him. Some saw his anger, but also understood why he was angry. Some, for the first time, felt that it might be conduct, not lineage, that determines knighthood. This is not a small thing in a world like Westeros. Sometimes a man's fate is changed not by a sword, but by the judgment of 2 or 3 people looking at him. And among the eyes watching Duncan in the Ashford meadow, there were eyes that reached all the way to the heart of the dynasty. Friends and rivals were now clear. In the next step, the price would come. Things escalated quickly at Ashford because, in Westeros, touching power always carries a price. Raising a hand against a prince is counted not merely as insulting one person, but as challenging the honor of the dynasty. Duncan knew this, of course, but his tragedy and his greatness come from the same point. Sometimes, even if he knows what will happen, he still does not step back, as he did after seeing what was done to Tansel. That is why the crisis at Ashford ceased to be an ordinary fight. It turned into a matter of judgment, honor, and setting an example. Even the air seemed to change. Perhaps the noise of the tourney grounds was the same. Again, hoofbeats, again vendors, again silk banners. But around Duncan, another sound was now moving. Whispers. Who is this giant man? Is he really a knight? He struck a prince. He will die. In Westeros, a whisper is sometimes sharper than a sword. It kills a man before the court is even convened. The road before Duncan was to be judged or to enter a trial of honor. And here, the story places him not only into a physical fight, but into a moral threshold, because Duncan's choice was this: to withdraw and stay silent to save his life, or to defend what he did and walk toward his possible death. He chose the second path. This choice is one of the keys that explains the rest of his life. Duncan has many flaws, but in some moments, he does not place fear ahead of his character. Then came the Trial of 7, one of the heaviest forms of Westeros's old tradition of law and honor. 7 against 7. Not only strength, also the answer to the question of who stands beside whom. A man's righteousness is sometimes tested by the sword, but before that, it is tested by whether people will risk death for him. For Duncan, this trial turned the soil of Ashford Meadow into blood. The details of this battle are told with different rhythms in different mouths, but the weight of its consequences is clear. Duncan was not alone. There were those who stood beside him, and across from him stood the arrogance and fury of the dynasty. Steel struck steel. Horses fell. Lances broke. Breath, dust, and shouting mixed together. Once the colorful polish of tourney games was stripped away, what remained was the same. The human body is fragile. Steel is merciless. The soil of Ashford learned this truth once again. then, with victory, came grief. The death of Prince Baelor Breakspear is one of the most painful knots in Duncan's life, as much as the exact lines of responsibility in the events. The symbolic weight of this death matters. Baelor was a figure within the dynasty who represented reason, balance, and noble dignity. His stand in Duncan's cause was not only helping one man, but defending the ideal of knighthood. His death showed how dearly even justice at Ashford could cost. Duncan lived, but he did not come out the same man, because he learned one thing: doing what is right does not always cleanse you. On the contrary, it can leave you with a guilt you will carry for the rest of your life. Saying I was right does not bring back the dead. Duncan's later heavy, hesitant mercy comes partly from here. After Ashford, he was no longer just a strong young man. He was a man who remembered the blood of a decision. And then the final curtain opened. Egg's identity was revealed. That ordinary-looking boy was Aegon of the Targaryen dynasty, a prince. The squire beside Duncan was the boy who would one day become king. This moment changes everything in retrospect. The mud at Ashford, the fights, the hunger, the arguments, all at once, they become tied to the center of Westerosi history. A hedge knight and a prince had fallen onto the same road. Fate was no longer only Duncan's fate. After Ashford, the road goes on, but some journeys grow even darker right after victory. One of the most important lessons in the later years of Duncan and Egg is that great evil does not always come in the form of dragon fire or great wars. Sometimes evil begins in a dried stream bed, in a broken dam, on the face of a starving peasant, in fields trapped between one lord's old right and another lord's new power. The world of the Sworn Sword period is exactly like this: quiet, hot, scorched, and dangerous. That season, even the color of the air had changed in the fields of the Reach. The ground cracked, the grass yellowed, the wind dry. If there is a mill in the distance, it turns slowly. If there is water, there is little of it. Drought does not strike only the crops. It also dries out a person's patience. In such times, oaths feel heavier, because to the ear of a hungry person, the word honor can sometimes land like an insult. This is the ground of the conflict in which Duncan and Egg found themselves. When they entered the service of Sir Eustace Osgrey, Dunk is once again forced to look at the difference between knighthood in songs and knighthood in reality. Eustace is an aging man clinging to the glory of the past, a landholder living among his losses, unwilling to let go of his pride, yet with his power diminished. His tower, his men, his memories, all carry a kind of sense of fading. Dunk is not unfamiliar with such men. Sir Arlen's poverty was of another kind, but it carried the smell of the same world, a great past, a narrow present. On the other side stands Lady Rohane Weber, a sharp-minded, strong-willed, hard woman of noble birth who does not hesitate to protect her own lands. Many of the male rivals Duncan encounters in his world act through brute force. Rohan, by contrast, uses the language of power and law together. This This makes the conflict more complex because the matter is not simple enough to be divided into good and evil. Water rights, borders, reputation, old grudges, all become entangled. And it is precisely here that the dark core within Duncan becomes visible. This core is not evil, on the contrary, it is the fragility within his goodness. Duncan often wants to do what is right, but he measures right, not from books of lineage, but from his conscience. The problem is this: conscience and oath do not always say the same thing. If you are serving a lord, his quarrel becomes your quarrel. But what if your lord is not right? Or even if he is right, what if his men are cruel? Or what if it is plainly obvious that the other side is human too? Dunk struggles with these questions. Those who look at him usually see a giant body. Inside, there is a mind constantly weighing. There are times when he thinks slowly, but he is not someone who strikes without thinking. At Ashford, he had acted in anger. Here, in the parched fields, he sees more clearly what anger can set ablaze. One wrong decision can kill peasants. One act of stubbornness can begin a blood feud that will last a long time. A move a knight makes in the name of honor can make the hunger of ordinary people even worse. For this reason, the Sworn Sword period is one of the most important layers of Duncan's moral maturation. Here, not his glory, but his judgment is tested. More than swinging a sword, he learns when to keep the sword in its sheath. He sees the power of words, the value of mediation, the loneliness and fear behind noble pride. His encounters with Rohani, Eustace's wounds, Egg's sharp observations, all of these take the idea of knighthood within Dunk out of rough heroism and carry it to a harder place, responsibility. But the dark core is not only the injustice of the outer world. Duncan's own past walks with him too. No matter how high a man from Flea Bottom rises among nobles, the feeling of inadequacy inside him does not die easily, especially while the official status of his knighthood remains uncertain. In some moments, Dunk feels like a stranger among them. In other moments, it is precisely thanks to this strangeness that he sees the truth more clearly, because he knows the kitchens of castles and the halls of towers as well. He knows what hunger is and what honor can cost. That is why Duncan's story is not only the story of a good man. This is the story of a man trying to remain good. And in Westeros, that is sometimes harder than killing a dragon. After the parched fields, the road takes Duncan and Egg into another darkness, a trap that looks like splendor, white walls, a castle, a tourney, colorful banners, feast tables, polished armor, smiling faces. From the outside, it looks like one of Westeros's familiar, noble displays. But one of the oldest tricks in this world is this: betrayal hides most often in halls where music is playing. That is why the Mystery Night is not only an adventure in Duncan's story, but a lesson in politics. When Dunk arrives at White Walls, he carries that vague feeling in the air that something is wrong. Large-bodied, plain-spoken men have one advantage. Even if they do not master the art of making schemes, they can smell false behavior. Duncan experiences this often as well. He may not solve subtle conspiracies at the first moment, but he senses when a smile does not reach the eyes, when a tourney is filled with too many selected faces, when some silences are too calculated. Egg, meanwhile, shows his worth once again here. Despite his young age, he reads courtly language, dynastic relationships, and the danger carried by names faster than Duncan. The strength of this pair lies precisely here. Dunk's honest strength and Egg's sharp understanding. Each covers the other's weakness, and at White Walls, this balance is needed not only to save themselves, but to prevent a greater disaster. Because behind the curtain, the Blackfire shadow is moving. The dynastic wounds of Westeros do not close easily. Once a claim to the throne is mixed with blood, it continues to live in whispers for generations. The tourney at White Walls is not merely a display of knighthood. It becomes a ground where loyalties are tested, and the old fire of rebellion is being blown on again. Duncan and Egg find themselves at the very center of this game. Here, Duncan's war has two layers. The first is the visible layer: sword, lance, duel, physical danger. In these, he is strong. His height, strength, and courage make him a dangerous opponent. But the real cost lies in the second layer. Walking through a hall without knowing whom to accuse, sensing that the consequences of a wrong move could shake the realm, and not being sure who is being used even while speaking what you believe to be right. This is different from the war of a hedge knight. On the road, when fighting a bandit, the rule is simple. At White Walls, however, everyone puts on a mask before drawing a sword. Here, Duncan is forced to use not only his body, but also his instinct. For a man accustomed to seeing himself as small, this is especially difficult, because to unravel a subtle game, sometimes you must trust yourself. One of Dunk's greatest developments becomes visible here, the feeling of, I am not stupid, I am only slow, turning into a kind of quiet maturity. The end of the White Walls events reveals the political reality of Westeros once again. Some men come with grand words, speak of great destinies, raise banners, whisper prophecies. Then they scatter in an instant. Because power is not only a claim, it is organization, patience, legitimacy, and fear. In this event, too, as the intrigue is unraveled, the polish of the tourney is stripped away, and what remains is fear, betrayal, ambition, and miscalculation. Duncan and Egg survive, but once again, with a little less of their innocence. The cost of war is not always a gravestone. Sometimes the cost is seeing the world more clearly, and that clarity kills some of the comfortable lies of youth. Duncan had begun to lose the romanticism of knighthood after Ashford. After White Walls, he loses political romanticism as well. The nobility of dynastic blood, courtly elegance, tourney splendor, none of these alone is a guarantee of virtue. In fact, most of the time, they cover the opposite. And yet, note this, Dunk does not become cynical after taking in this knowledge. This is one of the rarest sides of his character, because in Westeros, many people, when they see evil, either become like it or stop believing in anything. Duncan however, becomes more careful as he sees more. But he does not abandon the idea of goodness. He becomes less naive, but not more merciless. That is why, for him, the war and cost section produces not only wounds, but also resilience. And this resilience will turn him into a man who can one day stand beside kings, because to protect a king, strength alone is not enough. One must know what a human being is, both in their brightest form and in their most rotten form. Years pass, the child grows, egg, one day, truly draws near to the throne. In Westeros, the crown often goes not to the strongest, but to the one who survives illnesses, deaths, wars, unexpected losses, change the dynastic line. That shaved-headed prince, whose path crossed Duncan's in the mud, in time becomes Aegon Targaryen, and at last a king, Aegon the Fifth. This is one of the strongest turning points in Duncan's story, because the child who once gathered bedding beside him now carries the burden of the Seven Kingdoms. And who is the man standing beside the king? Duncan, from the roads. Not every step of this rise is told in detail in the sources. We do not have all of Dunk and Egg's journeys, their later adventures, their entries into court, and all their duties. Here, history is fragmentary, but the large line is clear. Duncan remained close to Aegon. He earned his trust, and in time he rose to the king's highest protective institution. He took a place in the King's Guard, and then became Lord Commander. For a child of Flea Bottom, there is almost no higher station than this. The white cloak is not only honor, it is discipline, loneliness, and invisibility. A knight of the King's Guard puts his own life in second place. He becomes the king's shadow. He does not found his own house, does not pursue inheritance, does not rule lands. For someone like Duncan, this role appears strangely natural, because from his youth, he had already learned to carry another's burden, to keep the night watch, and to think of duty before himself. But the word peak here does not mean rank alone. The real peak lies in the meaning Duncan represents. Aegon V is remembered as a king who knew the hardships of the people and tried to limit the arbitrary power of the nobles. His reformist side constantly clashes with the resistance of the aristocracy. In this context, Duncan's presence is symbolic. A man who came from among the common people, knew poverty, and sought knighthood more in conduct than in lineage, is now the one closest to the king. He stands upon the bridge between throne and soil, while the light of oil lamps flickers on the walls and palace corridors, while lords defend their own interests, while maesters weigh old laws. Duncan's very presence there is a message. He does not always need to speak. Sometimes simply who you are and what you represent matters. And Duncan quietly reminds Westeros of this. Virtue does not come only from noble birth. Of course, this peak does not bring perfect peace. Aegon's reign is not easy. The resistance of the great lords, the collapse of dynastic marriage plans, the kingdom straining between the old order and new needs. All of this makes the crown heavier. Duncan, too, lives near that weight. To protect the king sometimes means to put his body in the way. Sometimes it means witnessing the king's painful decisions. Loyalty here takes on a form harder than friendship in youth, because Egg is no longer only Egg. He is the king of Westeros. And when someone you once walked the roads with as a child becomes king, the meaning of staying loyal to him changes. Is it preserving the old friendship, showing loyalty to the office, staying silent when the king is wrong, or reminding him of the truth as part of protecting him? The sources do not give us all of those private conversations, but from what we know of Duncan's character, a strong sense arises that his loyalty was not made up of blind obedience alone. The highest point of the peak is often the coldest point. When Duncan reaches the White Cloak, the muddy roads of his youth seem as if they have been left behind. But in truth, those roads continue to live inside him. The smoke of Flea Bottom, the dust of Ashford, the cracks of the parched fields, the false light of white walls, all of it has settled into his decisions. Perhaps that is why, even among the many golden surfaces inside the palace, he continues to sense real danger. And perhaps that is why the end of his story is written not in a palace again, but in fire, because the peak is sometimes the silence just before the fall. In every great story, a moment comes when a person must make one final choice between the belief they have carried for years and the hard truth of the world. For Duncan, the road to this final transformation reaches into the last years of Aegon V. The king's intentions are great, but in Westeros, intention alone is not enough. Reforms strike resistance, dynastic plans crack, intrigues within the court, outside pressures, the desires of the dynasty's children. All of these weaken a king's hand. Aegon is a king who wants to protect the people, but the balance of power can sometimes drive even well-intentioned kings toward more dangerous pursuits. It is in this shadow that the road to Summerhall begins. Summerhall, a summer castle of the Targaryen dynasty. Stone, halls, memory, and an extension of dynastic pride. But in later years, this name is remembered less as the name of a castle and more as the name of a disaster. What the sources give is clear. One night, one fire, great losses. King Aegon V died there. Ser Duncan the Tall also died there. On that same night, Prince Rhaegar was born. A significant part of the remaining details lies in mist. And it is precisely this mist that makes the story even heavier, because people fill gaps with legend, dragon dreams, quests for magic, attempts at rebirth, prophecies. Much is whispered about Summerhall. The sources imply some aspects and do not state others openly. For that reason, it is easy to invent here. But the right thing is to walk carefully. What we know is that Aegon carried an obsessive hope concerning dragons and the fate of the dynasty, and that the Summerhall disaster appears connected to this hope. As for Duncan's role, the sources say that he was there and that he died there. This alone already says a great deal, because Duncan is not an ordinary court functionary who died beside a king. He is a man who defined his oath through action, throughout his life. We do not have a detailed, complete account of what Duncan did while Summerhall burned, but the line of his character is so clear that, in many tellings, his final moment is imagined as a rescue, a protection, a not returning. This is not a proven detail. It is a strong inference born from character, and the weight of that inference is great, because Duncan's whole life is built on not turning back at the most dangerous moment. He did not hold back for Tansel. He did not hold back at Ashford. He did not flee his conscience in the parched fields. He did not step away from the conspiracy at White Walls. Even when he rose beside the king, he did not run from the weight of duty. And while the fire rose at Summerhall, the ending that suits his story, and, with the limited information we have, the most meaningful ending, is once again death in the midst of duty. Sometimes a man's end gathers his whole life into a single image, a long white silhouette passing through the flames. Is this a fall? Yes, because there is death, because a king's last hope is turning to ash, because Summerhall burns not only people, but also the dreams of an era. But this is also a transformation, because Duncan's death takes him from a hedge knight walking the roads and turns him into a mythic figure of loyalty. No longer only Dunk, now a knight whose name, in the narratives of the realm, is spoken with disaster, but who met disaster with honor. And here, the bitterest form of irony appears. A man who never wanted the throne, who had no lineage, who was not born for the court, in the end, dies at the center of the dynasty's innermost tragedy. The road that began in Flea Bottom ends on the burned stones of Summerhall. All those years in between, all those wars, all those oaths, it is as if they were all preparing for this single night. When the fire dies, what remains is stone, ash, and stories. Some are told true, some are not. But Duncan's name is not lost in those ashes. After catastrophes, the first thing the world does is fall silent. It was the same after Summerhall. Smoke rose, the news spread, names were counted, mourning was observed. But, like every great catastrophe, this event also produced two things at the same time: official records and endless rumors. The records tell us who died, what burned, and which dynastic lines were affected. The rumors, meanwhile, tell of the causes, the final moments, the sounds that were heard, the lights that were seen. Duncan's after lives precisely at the intersection of these two realms. The king is dead. Duncan is dead. But the Targaryen story does not end. Rhaegar, born that same night, would later become one of the most central figures in the history of Westeros. There is a chilling poetic quality in this detail itself. As the old generation departs in a fire, a new generation is born. Flame destroys on one side and leaves an inheritance on the other. That is why Summerhall is counted not only as an end, but also as a beginning. Duncan's death, too, is written into this transition. So how does the legacy of a hedge knight live on after disaster? First, in people, especially in those who knew him, those who walked with him, in the line he protected. Aegon's reign may not record Duncan's influence directly in a single sentence, but the importance of the companion who shaped a king's character cannot be underestimated. When Egg was a child, he did not see only fighting from Duncan. Through him, he also saw the people, poverty, injustice, and the difference between false glory and true virtue. Then, legacy lives in institutions. The white cloak of the King's Guard has rested on many shoulders, but not every Lord Commander carries the same weight. Duncan's name reminds us that this office is not only palace polish. In the right man's shoulders, the white cloak can be a wall, not only a wall that protects the king from an external enemy, but a wall that separates him from the false brilliance around him. This is not a written law, but it is an invisible tradition that great knights leave behind in institutions. And then, legacy lives in stories. Songs in tales, the words of soldiers by campfires, short notes in the margins of maesters' records. Figures like Duncan, over time, split into two: Duncan the man and Duncan the legend. The human one makes mistakes, hesitates, understands late, feels shame, grows angry. The legendary one is told as if he always did the right thing at the right time. The truth is probably somewhere between the two. And this is what makes Duncan powerful. His flaws do not diminish him. They make him accessible. The emptiness left behind after him is not only the emptiness of a physical protector. Westeros, especially in times of dynastic turmoil, needs strong characters with good intentions. When a man like Duncan is gone, the place left empty cannot be filled by just another tall knight, because the matter is not height or skill with a sword. It is an inner compass. There are many sword masters in the history of Westeros. Sword masters with an inner compass are fewer. As the wind moves among the burned stones of Summerhall, you can feel this. The stones do not speak, but sometimes, even from silence, a theme rises. The cost of ambition, the cost of hope, the cost of loyalty. Duncan stands at the very center of these three themes. The king's hope takes him into the fire. The dynasty's ambition magnifies the disaster. Duncan's loyalty, however, makes his name honorable even within that disaster. This, in truth, is what we mean by aftermath. After a man dies, what remains is not only what he did. What remains is what he represented. What Duncan represented is that, even in a hard and class-bound world like Westeros, character can be as decisive as lineage. Perhaps it does not always win. Perhaps it cannot save him from the fire either, but it leaves a mark within history, and some marks outlive crowns. When you look at Ser Duncan the Tall's story from beginning to end, the first thing it seems to be is a tale of rise, from the streets to the court, from squirehood to the white cloak, from poverty to closeness with the king. But when you go a little deeper, you realize that this is not a classic success story, because his losses are as defining as Duncan's gains. As he gains renown, he loses innocence. As his rank rises, his loneliness increases. As he draws closer to the king, the cost of decisions grows heavier. And yet, what makes him unforgettable is that he does not break under these costs. Duncan is not flawless. He can anger quickly, Sometimes he understands slowly. He gets caught in the subtleties of noble games. He doubts his own adequacy. Even the legitimacy of his knighthood remains a shadow throughout his life. But perhaps that is exactly why he is a true figure of knighthood, because his virtue does not come from flawless birth. It is born from the decisions he makes, despite his flaws. This is something rare for Westeros. In a world where lineage, blood, and dynastic name are constantly pushed to the forefront, Duncan brings another measure: conduct. Not whose son you are, but whom you stand beside. Not how well you wield a sword, but when you do not draw it, what you do when you have power, what you are willing to risk while someone powerless is being crushed. Duncan's life consists of scenes in which these questions are answered one by one, and his legacy does not belong only to the past. What makes Duncan's story powerful today is that it is universal. Every age has its Ashford, a moment of cruelty when the crowd falls silent. Every age has its drought, a condition of poverty in which law and conscience clash. Every age has its white walls, ambition hiding behind brilliance. Every age has its summer hall, the moment when good intentions can join with obsession and turn into disaster. In each of these scenes, Duncan returns to the same fundamental question: what is right now? He does not always find the right answer at once, but he does not stop searching. Perhaps that is why his story is as much a story of education as it is of swords and tourneys. It educates not only Egg, but us as well, about what knighthood is, about what power ought to be used for, about when loyalty is exalted and when it becomes blind, and most importantly, about why trying to be a good person is often heavier than it appears. At the end of this road, stretching from Flea Bottom to Summerhall, Duncan leaves us this: renown passes, bloodlines break, castles burn, but the risk a man takes for others is still told centuries later. The lessons to be drawn from this life: ambition, rising by itself, is not virtue. Duncan rose, but he did not sell himself in order to rise. The value of ambition is measured not so much by where it takes you, but by what you preserve while rising. Duty, loyalty, does not mean blind obedience. True duty is not only taking orders, it is remembering the essence of what you swore to. Duncan's loyalty reached to persons, but it was bound more deeply to his principles. Pride, the most dangerous poison of power, is the feeling that it cannot happen to me. In princes, lords, rebels, and even well-intentioned kings, pride can give birth to disaster. The shadow of Summerhall reminds us of this painfully. Love, truly seeing people, disrupts the easy answers of the order. Duncan's greatest strength was that he saw not only his friends, but ordinary people as well. Mercy is often a quiet rebellion against the hardness of order. Fear, courage is not fearlessness. It is taking a step despite fear. Duncan was afraid many times, but in critical moments, he was not someone ruled by fear. What made him great was not that he destroyed fear, but that he did not surrender to it. Power, the most honorable use of power, is protection. Duncan had his body, his sword, his rank, and his reputation. He used them not to crush, but to stand as a shield. Power gains meaning only in this form. Tonight, we walked the road of Ser Duncan the Tall together. If this telling left a mark on you as well, you can quietly leave a sign of support, a like, a subscription, perhaps a road sign for the next night. There are many more lives to tell in the dark history of Westeros, and sometimes the greatest stories are not the stories of those who sit the throne, but of those who return to the fire.